Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special event. I'm UC Santa Cruz Chancellor Cynthia LaRive. I want to thank you for joining us, and this is the 20th Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. The Maitra Lecture is among our series of premier lectures at UC Santa Cruz. It has brought renowned thinkers to UC Santa Cruz, enriching the intellectual life of our campus and of the community at large. It is a moment when we all come together to ponder the issues of our time and do so from a humanist perspective. Over the years, Maitra Lecture Series speakers have offered us great insights on a host of topics. Lecturers include writers, academics, scientists, artists, a Nobel laureate economist, Janet Yellen, the current U.S. Treasury Secretary and former chair of the Federal Reserve. She was our speaker in 2019. Amartya Sen, the Indian economist and philosopher, spoke last year. And this year, I'm very excited to have with us Dr. Partha Mitter, a writer and historian of Indian art and culture. It's especially fitting given that we have recently launched an exciting center on South Asia studies. Now I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Anu Luther. We owe a number of thanks to people for this series. Kiran and Arjun Malhotra's generous gift established the endowment that supported this series for more than 2 decades now. And we have deep gratitude for entrepreneur and businesswoman Anu Luther. Anu has been a dear friend of UC Santa Cruz and of mine. She is a current UC Santa Cruz Foundation trustee and former president of our foundation. She taught economics for us, and she launched this series to honor her late husband, Sid Maitra. I wish I could have known Sid. I think he was a really marvelous man. He was a scientist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist of great vision with deep appreciation for the humanities. This lecture series is a wonderful legacy in that it preserves Sid's memory while expanding our horizons. Please join me in welcoming Anu Luther, who will tell us more about the Maitra Lecture Series and about tonight's distinguished speaker.
Indeed, our distinguished speaker, Partha Mitter, Professor Partha Mitter, is my late husband's uncle, but this is not nepotism. Partha is emeritus professor in art history, University of Sussex, and adjunct research professor, Carleton University. He's based in England, where he is a fellow many times over. In America, he has held prestigious fellowships from Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, the Getty Research Institute, and the National Gallery of Art. In 2000, he was invited by the Indian government to set up the School of Art and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He is considered the foremost living historian of Indian art. This reputation is based primarily on a trilogy of books, variously described as magisterial, a landmark of art history and post-colonial scholarship, one of the most influential art books of the century. The brilliant Viennese art historian Ernst Gombrich had asked Partha a simple question: why do I find Indian art so difficult to relate to? Partha was the perfect person to ask this of. Born in Calcutta to parents who were true cosmopolitans in their lives and thinking, his languages were Bengali and Sanskrit, English and French, and his favorite music was Fayaz Khan's Rag Bhairavi and Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Partha's answer became his PhD thesis under Gambridge, Much Maligned Monsters, A History of European Reactions to Indian Art. Two later books were Art and Nationalism in Colonial India, 1850 to 1922, Occidental Orientations, The Triumph of Modernism, Indian Artists and the Avant-Garde, 1922 to 1947. These books are often displayed on coffee tables, but one would realize very quickly that these are not books you can glance through during lulls in conversation. There is a certain meta quality to them. He's speaking to other art historians. But he has written a trade book, Indian Art and the Art History, and jointly edited 20th Century Art, which leads off with several of his articles. I first met Sid's uncle Partha 50 years ago. Sid was a mathematician. I was a student of mathematical economics. And our favorite scholarly interactions were about simple, elegant theorems. We had very little understanding of or interest in art. That was something you did if you could not do math. Our walls were by choice bare. I was merely being respectful when I showed an interest in an uncle's profession. Partha's answers would start with, Anuradha, it's complicated, and sometimes they would take days to complete. But very quickly, I was charmed and hooked. And the best way I can explain my journey through his books is for me to be born and reborn in various centuries, always as a Western art historian, and with Partha along for the ride. Another version of everything, everywhere, all at once. My first incarnation is in 14th century Europe. My compatriots have started traveling to India. What they see are gigantic rock carvings, many-limbed, multi-headed statues with human forms, sculptures of male-female sex organs. All are worshipped, often in temples with ornate and polychromatic decor. The travelers return home with their accounts. Based on these narratives, illustrators draw pictures for us. We believe in Christ and the devil. Our classical canon knows that beauty requires harmony, proportionality, balance. It is clear to us that Hinduism is a pagan religion of a decaying civilization that worships fearful monsters and grossly erotic images. It takes over 300 years, many avatars, the development of objective archaeology, and a humanistic view of the world, a working understanding of Sanskrit, and Partha's voice in my ear before I can lay to rest the monster myth and have a true iconographic understanding of Indian art in terms of context and meaning rather than pure aesthetic response. What Partha says to me is this: historian, know thyself. Evaluate the influence of your pre-existing frameworks of thought, your place in the power structures of colonialism and imperialism, and understand that art itself is culturally determined and cannot be objectively ranked. I understand this all well enough to upend my earlier misperceptions. I see that a high philosophical form of Hinduism existed, though in a society which recognized that profound spiritual ideas are better understood by the common person through symbols and allegory. Multiple gods, many limbs and heads represent different attributes of one supreme deity. They are profound, enigmatic symbols of Hinduism. The mythology actually captures a cosmology. Ornamentation reflects authentic Indian taste, not decadence. The time is right for another book, Art and Nationalism in Colonial India. Now I'm reborn in the 19th century. There is a Western Renaissance in art, with a perfected medium of oil paints and the development of dazzling techniques using mathematical principles, blending and blurring, foreshortening, chiaroscuro, to render three-dimensional figures on a two-dimensional plane and create the illusion that it is the real thing. Paint a grape so that a bird would peck on it. In response, art schools are set up all over India to teach a superior academic art. And what is the Indian reaction? It's complicated. Appreciation, adoption, adaptation, opposition. Partha chronicles this for me with amazing depth and detail. But my guru is also whispering another mantra. He says, you had previously learned that context is all. But context is not just about the external environment in which artists operate. It has to include the motivations of the artists. I now see the search for an indigenous identity in a nation that has been stitched together into a political entity by the British. Artists seek a native visual language, he says. Some learn Western techniques well, but go back to pre-colonial indigenous images of goddesses and kings. Others insist on a language of flatness, present in miniature paintings, to represent the opposite of the materialism of the West, Indian spirituality. They also search for an indigenous palette of paints. I'm happy that I have avoided the trap that other Western historians have fallen into, where successful imitation is aping, the imperfect imitation is a failure of learning, and rejection is blasphemy. Finally, the triumph of modernism. Now I'm reborn in the 20th century. Things are changing dramatically in the West. Cézanne revolutionizes art by using alternating warm and cool colors to create dimensionality. And Picasso dissolves form. A painting, he says, is not real life, it is a painting. Distortion and fragmentation capture that idea. The global primitivism movement captures the desire for a simpler life removed from the ills of industrialization, pollution, alienation. The movement for independence from British rule is gathering steam in India, and Indian artists feel the urge to participate. Movingly and brilliantly, Partha describes the ways in which local artists speak the new global language of art to create the visual identity of their emerging nation. Gaganendranath Tagore, Amrita Shergill, Rabindranath Tagore, Jamini Roy, each has a different motive. The melancholy rural life, the inner struggles of the artist, art as a collaborative process and a collective experience. Partha now asks me a question. Why are your colleagues, me, the avatar, why are your colleagues derisively labeling these works derivative? These are the same people who refer to Picasso's debt to African tribal art as an affinity, as coincidence. He teaches me to think of avant-garde Indian artists not as imitating, but using a new global syntax, a language, to communicate. He teaches me to characterize global modernity accurately and respectfully, a process of enriching cross-fertilization, not an exclusive Western phenomenon that seeped into the peripheries. Along the way, he has also taught me to have a capacious definition of aesthetics, not as just beauty, but including a sense of awe and wonder, of surprise. I now step out of my multiverse, my cycle of birth and rebirth, and it is a shock. I'm not Michelle Yeoh, Partha is not my husband, and I did not attain nirvana. But I have finally understood why things are complicated. Recently, I asked Partha how he views his contribution to his discipline. This time he said it simply and modestly. I've tried to decolonize art history. But I hope you see how he has altered the nature of discourse in his discipline and provided a framework, concepts, and language for not just post-colonial scholars, but also for the public, curators, collectors, artists. His influence has gone far beyond scholarship and art history, and it will be felt for a very long time. I think I could have introduced him as one of our foremost historians of culture, not just Indian, not just art. I'm proud of him, grateful to him, but now I must worry about how to reconcile Partha's perspectives with the personality of the man after whom this lecture series is named. Sid equated beauty with simplicity and mathematical certainty. He built a home in the shape of a solitaire ring, combining the pure curve of a circle with the diamantine strength of the hexagon, and asked that no paintings be hung in our home. He was an atheist. Shrines were not fine, and monasteries were monstrosities. Partha glorifies dissolving certainties. He lectures on the subjective nature of art. He cannot get away from glorious examples of sacred art. His hobby is painting. But what can I say? It's complicated and simple. I love them both. And together, they represent the aesthetic perfection of a Bindu painting by Raza, the brilliant primary colors of home, concentric circles, plus the most profound symbol of Hindu cosmology, the point of all creation, the Bindu. It is black. Surprisingly, it is black. The scientist sees a black hole, the artist an amalgamation of all colors. Beautiful, sublime, picturesque. In honor of the first artists of antiquity of Partha's trilogy, those who anonymously created magnificent sculptures and paintings out of love and reverence, as well as modernist Jamini Roy, for whom art was about community and sharing, I would like to acknowledge my many debts, but without naming the individuals. From UCSC, Chancellor, Provost, Deans, professors, students, the university events team, our IT geniuses. And the co-sponsor of this lecture, the Center for South Asian Studies. Others in the audience, including my father, my husband, my sister, my children, my many, many friends and donors who continue to contribute to this series and help grow it. And most importantly, the eminent, distinguished Professor Partha Mitter, who will deliver our lecture today.
I'm well prepared with lots of different things. By the way, if my voice breaks, and it does occasionally, I'd ask your indulgence. Yes, lots of reasons why it happens. But anyway, let me first start with Anu. I mean, it's a beautifully presented account of my work. I couldn't have said it better, succinctly, and really, in a way, sort of profound understanding. My lecture, I hope, wouldn't be too complicated, hopefully. But before that, I'd like to thank the Chancellor, Provost, Dean of Humanities, Center for South Asian Studies, Christine Palmer and Nicole Silver. I mean, without their help, I couldn't have made this lecture. I hope it'll be interesting. And of course, my dear niece, Anuradha Luther, Anu Maitra. Okay, right. Now, so what I thought was, I'll sit down. The reason being, I prefer to have a conversation. And since it's going to be a global conversation I'm talking about, I thought this would be much better than standing and giving a talk. I've done that for many years. This is better, I find it. Okay, so as Anu mentioned, we are gathered here tonight to honor my very dear nephew by marriage, Sidhartha, or Sid, as he was known to his friends. We all loved him. Now, since I have the word cosmopolitan in my talk, he was a true cosmopolitan at home in India and the US, who looked optimistically to the day when people would be able to travel the world directly from home without going through the hassle of waiting at airports, and perhaps without immigration officials. He told me that himself. Sadly, couldn't put it into practice. He had also dreamed of flying across the globe in his own aircraft. Now, interestingly, Sid came from an Orthodox Hindu family, but he was a man without prejudice, rational. And of course, I mean, it's the 20th series, but it is also fitting that I personally dedicate this lecture on cosmopolitan values to his memory. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start. The distinguished historian Ramchandra Guha recently wrote how he found a way of coping with COVID-19. We've all been affected by that. He turned to the 19th century Italian writer Emilio Salgari, who remarked that, and I quote, "Reading is traveling without the bother of luggage. Being forced into confinement at home, literature could help one travel to different countries and different times in imagination," end quote. How apt. It prompted my own thoughts about the nature of cultural exchanges, of crossing borders, as it were. The substance of my talk tonight, I've been thinking about it for a long time, and friends say, when are you going to talk about virtual cosmopolitan and so on? So I thought I'd better bite the bullet and produce a paper. It's very much a working progress paper. Now, border regimes, to invoke our great art historian Abib Warburg, they're a metaphor for geopolitical boundaries that delimit national styles and academic disciplines and treat with disapproval so-called cultural borrowings. You mustn't do that. Oh, you know, somebody else's. And there are reasons for that. Indeed, cultural flows in multiple directions has been a fact of human history, right from the ancient times. Cross-pollination among plants is a normal process, possessing positive qualities. However, in the context of European colonial expansion, I want to stress this, cross-fertilization in human society was denigrated as a superior culture dominating inferior ones. So the thrust of my talk tonight is to shine, hopefully, a new light into the rather contested subject of colonial domination. There's a lot written about it, as you know. Now, European expansion, directly or indirectly, created a situation in which the Westerners actually found themselves often couldn't control. But modernity, and I stress this, as such, is a much larger phenomenon, which unleashed greater forces that transformed the globe through transport and communication revolutions, but of course not forgetting mass migrations. By the 1890s, railway networks covered large parts of the globe. And let me say my first, coming to that. Right. So this is a steam train. I mean, it's actually a recent photograph, but it's an old steam train from the early 20th century. Now, so trains, steamships sailing across the newly created Suez Canal drastically reduced the duration of sea voyages between Europe and Asia. Another example I show you. Of course, The most famous, the Queen Mary. So just to give you a sense of the things that were changing. Communication revolution in particular had an even more profound impact. The earth shrank because information traveled at lightning speed, thanks to the courtesy of the telegraph. British and India were able to control the vast territory more efficiently by means of railways and the telegraph. I mean, they used to send telegram, oh, there's a big rebellion in Northwest Frontier, send your troops there. And so that was a big kind of advantage. Now, interestingly, throughout the modern period, communication innovation have continued relentlessly. The wireless improving upon the telegraph. But need I remind you, we're all sitting here in California, Silicon Valley, that today all our lives have been transformed by the World Wide Web. That was, of course, coined by an Englishman. But perhaps no change was more far-reaching than the large-scale migrations and population displacement. And that's a very important issue. This was a product of colonial expansion, which inevitably led to sustained encounters between Europeans and the rest of the world. I mean, indentured labor, slavery, etc. So colonial encounters indeed led to refashioning the word cosmopolitan as an idea and a phenomenon. Now let's turn to the nature of cosmopolitan itself. A key term, as I mentioned, we all use it. But what does it really mean? So I turn, inevitably, being a pedant, to Oxford Dictionary, which defines a cosmopolitan as someone who's free from provincialism and national prejudice and has positive experience of other cultures. I mean, I imagine the term cosmopolitan to be a seasoned world traveler of the previous era. Often traveling on passenger liners in search of the exotic and the unfamiliar. Here is again a promenade deck from one of the ships, the early period. Interestingly, since I'm in the States, wealthy Americans, for instance, started visiting India, my country, from the end of the 19th century. Among them, of course, the famed writer Mark Twain, an admirer of India, made the quip, I quote, "India confronts you with riddles, which are a trifle more perplexing when they explain than when they were before." I mean, so it's but we know, in the West probably, less about wealthy Asian travelers, and there were many. The celebrated Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, for instance, made a number of world tours between the 20s and the 30s. In fact, I always think that he is the most famous individual in the world, East and West, between 1913 and 1940. There exist rare photographs of Tagore taken in the garden. Just one second, let me show you. A garden of the French banker Albert Kahn, who created the famous Archives of the Planet. Excuse me, a treasure trove of photographs from around the world. And here you see Tagore. I'm not going to smash it. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So, recently, today, in the light of massive globalization, cosmopolitanism has become a battleground. So let me serve you a tasting menu of the debate. The very well-known philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah at Princeton takes a universalist position in order to inject an ethical dimension to the debate. He is from a very distinguished family, from one of the major, well-known chiefs in Ghana, as well as Sir Strafford Cripps's grandson. He views cosmopolitan values as the thread that ties human beings together. And he rejects nationalist claims to an exclusivist cultural patrimony. Everyone, he says, has a right to share our common heritage, regardless of race, gender, and orientation. Appiah's universalism is, of course, a welcome corrective to the politics of difference and identity, but it doesn't really address power and authority, visibility, because you need that, and inclusion in the uneven relationship between the haves and have-nots. That's a fact of history. Such cosmopolitanism confers privilege. Craig Cahun, another writer on cosmopolitanism, points out, because it fails to consider those who are bereft of power, like refugees, for instance. Professor James Clifford of UC Santa Cruz, you know him, makes a powerful intervention in challenging European claims to the sole authorship of cosmopolitan modernity. His idea of discrepant cosmopolitanism makes a strong case for heterogeneous modernity. Modernity. Yes. It talks about interconnected world. Now, if I can summarize his complex ideas in an evocative work called Roots. Clifford employs the term travel to undermine the exclusive claims of elite cosmopolitans. Population movement in modernity was more significant than European expansionism. He thereby brings out the inner tensions and contradictions, thank you, between the centrality of the West and the possibility of other cosmopolitanism. And about Marxists, Timothy Brennan, of course, mounts a full frontal assault on the present debates. He dismisses them as handmaidens of American cultural hegemony. So this is the basic debate going on. But I'm not directly concerned with that. My main concern, and that's the theory I'm going to develop slowly, I hope, is with a very different sort of cosmopolitan. He or she doesn't leave their home. Let's say they sit in a small study, possibly in a modest home, school teachers, lowly clerks, and what have you. But they have the knowledge of the whole world at their fingertips. You see how? I will soon explain. So I'm taking cosmopolitanism as a working hypothesis, but I would like to extend its scope in the global economy of knowledge. Now, I call these cross-cultural circulations of information as conversations across national boundaries, crossing borders, as it were. But also, think about what happens to these forms of knowledge when they begin their afterlives in other cultures. They're transformed, absorbed, translated, transmuted. Now, this is where I come to my idea and my point in proposing the concept of the virtual cosmopolitan. I use the word advisedly, both virtual and cosmopolitan. I argued that the reception of Western ideas in the periphery, these are, let's say, the colonized countries in particular, and also geographically marginal, like Australia, for instance, these reception of these ideas of modernity was an active process that centered on the cultural agency of the colonized. So let me start to unpack my ideas one by one. I take historian Mary Louise Pratt, who proposes the notion of contact zones. So that's first point, which has wide implications. She writes, I quote again, "It's a space of colonial encounters in which people, geographically and historically separated, come into contact with each other and establish relations, usually involving coercion, radical inequality, and conflict." But they also set up interactive dimension ignored by accounts of conquest and domination. So it's a colonial thing. Interlocking understanding, often within radically asymmetrical relations of power, uneven. But very true, very good. But I want to take her definition in a different direction. What interests me in her approach is not so much the role of power. I accept it, of course, in such transactions, but the fact that it allows for the possibility of a more productive relationship between cultures as a species of exchange and negotiation. In short, conversation. That's what I'm basically talking about. But how did societies come into contact with one another in the modern age? So perhaps a less explored aspect of colonial expansion is the imposition of one dominant or hegemonic, I call it hegemonic language, in a particular colony. I know English, of course. The English was introduced in the British Empire in India, systematized through the education curriculum. Equally, the French, of course, imposed their mother tongue, even as Spanish and Portuguese became the dominant language in South and Central America. One thing that struck me, that the Dutch didn't feel the need to impose their language on the Indonesian archipelago, and I don't know why. Perhaps the Dutch didn't feel so proud of the language, I'm not sure. I don't know, this is an interesting issue. Now, to take the example I'm most familiar with, English was imposed in schools and later universities in Bengal, replacing Sanskrit and Farsi, Persian, as the dominant language. I have another quotation. "A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia," end quote. Declared Lord Macaulay with his usual and sincere flourish. But actually, the great Indian reformer Ram Mohan Roy agreed that a knowledge of English would help make Indians, and Bengalis of course, competitive in the world. But there were unintended consequences of introducing English in Bengal. The Bengali language didn't die out, never. It is modernized. It now enjoyed a new lease of life, producing some of the finest poetry, novel and short stories, not to mention political and social discourses. Ideas of European Enlightenment, translated, transformed, assimilated, became a vehicle of the Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century. And of course, the best known product of this powerful intellectual movement, as we all know, is the poet Rabindranath Tagore. But there were many others who remain unknown outside Bengal. In short, Bengali bilingualism and, we might say, double heritage had a powerful impact on his response to modernity. India, we know, is a land of over 26 languages, 5 or 6 scripts, I think, and 250 dialects. It's a Babel. It's different. I mean, I do not follow most languages. Hindi just thora, and but I mean, Tamil and other languages I wouldn't know. English education helped build up a political conscious elite that transcended linguistic provinces into which India was divided. Our Indian National Congress, the most important nationalist party, grew in strength from early political debates in English, following Burke and others, they learned. The political theorist Benedict Anderson, many of us know, developed the concept of imagined communities. He argues that it provides essential conditions for nationhood. How? This unity was achieved through print culture, books, newspapers, magazines, and so on. Now, it's interesting, and that's the important point. Members of the imagined community had no direct contact with one another, but shared a social or intellectual space. Actually, we see this in the case of India, where political discourse was conducted in English for many years, until Gandhi came on the scene. It's very interesting, Mahatma Gandhi. But the problem with a multilingual subcontinent with low standards of literacy, the imagined community would only be relevant to the educated. English educated. So how did ideas of nationhood circulate among the unlettered? Now, this is something I've been talking about for a number of years. The theorist Walter Benjamin speaks of the role of mechanical reproduction in the dissemination of mass prints. It could be very easily produced and circulated, and which had its impact on the spread of popular images in India. Coming to this, Indian printmakers, they're very clever. They quickly mastered the technology of printmaking and soon ousted cheap German prints from the market. In fact, lots of German prints were, you might call them erotic or pornographic according to your inclination. So anyway, Pune Chitrashala Press produced a large number of images on nationalist themes. This is especially in Maharashtra, including those of, on the left, the Peshwa, Bajirao Peshwa. These were the last independent rulers of Maharashtra, and very much idolized and became very important inspiration. And on the right, of course, you see, these Peshwas were the last ones to resist British rule. It was Lord Wellesley. Okay, Arthur Wellesley. The right one is the great warlike goddess, Devi or Durga, usually 10 arms, who destroys demons. Well, you realize the metaphorical allusion to foreign devils didn't go unnoticed. So that actually started happening quite a lot. Okay. In short, mass prints of nationalist icons helped spread ideas of one nationhood among people throughout India. So these prints enabled the common people, the unlettered, and actually a majority of whom were Hindus, the largest population, to equate religion with nationhood wasn't a good thing eventually, but that's another matter. I was fascinated with Anderson's idea, but I felt that his idea could be taken in a different direction. And its scope could be expanded. Now, what I want you to do is to think of these imagined communities globally. I'm going to explain. To put it in a nutshell, a novel cultural space opened up in the wake of worldwide spread of print culture, and that actually spread around the world during the colonial period. It also helped introduce ideas of modernity to regions outside Europe. So transmission of knowledge between the center, metropolis, Europe, what have you, and the periphery, all the regions, the colonized, took place in an imagined community that I describe as and this is why I come to virtual cosmopolis. The participants had no direct contact with one another, but contributed to the creation of an informal network of the imagination, of the mind. Well, see one or two examples. But my other point is that the reception of Western ideas in the peripheries, margins, and the colonized countries in particular, and right through the world. And I want to stress this. It was an active process, not as often claimed passive process, in which the agency was shared between the colonizers and the colonized. Let's think of the background. This is from the 16th century onwards, Portuguese seaboard empire and so on. European expansion gave rise to the phenomenon of what you might call hybrid settlements, often centering on port cities, or you might call it entrepôts. They were called factories, where goods were kept. And this was for the circulation of material goods. And here, the local merchants, as well as bilingual middlemen of Calcutta, Bombay, I'm using old names, Shanghai, Singapore, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, to name a few of the best known. They emerged as thriving centers of cultural interchange. And this is interesting. These hybrid sites, as you can think of Shanghai, for instance, even today, became the confluence of multilingual and multicultural peoples. Later, they served as negotiators in the spread of ideas of modernity from the colonial cities to the countryside. That's how also nationalism spread. I was not a signal for anything. No. Sorry, I don't want to go into too many anecdotes, but previously, especially earlier centuries, in opera, when the audience didn't like it, they started throwing things. Okay, sorry. Large-scale production of text and images in English, for instance, the most important international language, began circulating worldwide. Books, magazines, and journals, as well as elegant reproductions of European masterpieces. This is very important. I think if I'm right, yeah. You see, Ravi Verma was the most important Indian academic painter in the 19th century, Victorian painter, you might say. He regularly studied art plates from illustrated Royal Academy journals, which are available. So, in fact, I won't go into another issue. It's very interesting that reproductions were far more influential than original paintings in creation of modern painting. And that actually includes not only colonists, but Picasso as well, which I learned. Okay. Now, this is interesting. Printed journals carried Western culture to the European spheres of influence in Asia. I want to take up Punch. Did you know it's a conservative, middle-class magazine, used to be very popular right through late 19th, whole of second half of 19th century, all the way up to 1950s. When I came to Britain as a young student, I was offered a job at one of these, where they still printed Punch. Now, what I find, its in-jokes are rather tame, I think rather English. They're not very funny and shouldn't make sense to a foreigner. But I can't explain again why. It had phenomenal success around the world, not only in Euro-America, and this is interesting, it spread across Asia and North Africa, Cairo, Shanghai, and all the way, to all these different countries. And it had phenomenal success. Ottoman Empire, and British India, China, and Japan. There were also independent creations from Punch I better go to the of the satirical magazine in local languages. I'll just take the example of India, and I thought I'd show you on the, of course, left is the typical cover of Punch, and this is Hindi Punch, very important, comic magazine, very political, but also interestingly, sorry, there was Bengali Punch, Bashantak, there was Urdu Punch, Awadh Punch, and many local, even provincial offshoots. Now, one thing I must warn you, vernacular incarnations of the conservative comic magazine transferred outside Britain became striking vehicles for anti-colonial resistance. I mean, I was surprised to find how quickly Punch spread. And again, these things are very difficult to explain why. Now, that brings us conveniently back to our virtual cosmopolitan. Who are they? We can imagine him and her, I've told you, seated in a small study, surrounded by books and journals, the world's literature at their fingertips. So the virtual cosmopolitan in the colonies was able to engage with the printed text emanating from the center and generate new forms of knowledge. We've seen that a real, not real, I wouldn't use the word, typical cosmopolitan individual, like Tagore, implies privilege. He was wealthy, plus freedom of mobility. But all that a virtual cosmopolitan requires is access to the printed material. And these Bengali, they're not very wealthy or anything, they were reading this, Tom Paine, French Revolution, and lots of other things, and created their own forms of resistance. So, put it in a nutshell, Indian intellectuals excuse me, were operating in a virtual space that generated a mode of conversation across cultures, leading to the production of new ideas. Now, I've stressed that these global cultural exchanges are necessarily dependent on direct power relations. But at the same time, I could be asked, come on, surely one can't deny the uneven relationship between the metropolis and its margins. So what theoretical underpinning can we deploy to make sense of these cultural exchanges that aren't prejudged by dependency syndrome, yes, derivative they're not really original. Now here, I'm into a bit more difficult territory. I hope it won't be too difficult. It won't be. You're all highly intelligent. I found the Russian critic, Mikhail Bakhtin, very interesting. He uses the term dialogic, and it's very, very useful. Why? So let me try and put it to you. Bakhtin proposes what he calls intertextuality, the relationship between texts, or structural relation between text and its context, as a way of understanding the evolution of literature. And he coined the term dialogic to describe a continuous dialogue between works of literature. The process appropriates the words of others, transforms them, translates them according to one's creative intentions. This is a dynamic process, relational, and engage in endless redescriptions of one's old world vision, Weltanschauung. Of course, Bakhtin was a literary critic, and he applied his ideas to literary texts. But I found it could be a very useful tool for us, for our cross-cultural analysis of colonial relations. Bakhtin speaks of intertextuality, the relation between texts and ideas within, I call it a field of text-based networks, which engages in the circulation of ideas. Now, no idea is totally sui generis. Each work of literature inherits the corpus of previous literature, tradition. In its turn, each new text generates new ideas that further development of literature, but also culture. Bakhtin's theory has come to be celebrated as you know, the dialogic method. Now, I'm going to suggest his theory to argue that any appropriation is only possible through cultural translation that makes sense of the translator's own world image, or as I call it, Weltanschauung. The particular advantage of the dialogic method for us is that it allows for the coexistence of different approaches in a relativist way. So it doesn't set up essentially a hierarchy of ideas and values. So this is superior, this is Western, this is non-Western. So that's colonial. So it really recognized the coexistence and mutual influence of multiple cultures within this informal global network. It's a really network through literature and so on. So, yeah, so that carries ideas of modernity. Let me take an example, which I find very interesting. Let's find a virtual cosmopolitan living in a remote district of Bengal. When the virtual cosmopolitan received a published literary or political text from Europe, he or she assimilates it within its own cultural universe. So this is an act of translation, giving rise to new ideas. I've chosen, and reading him, I've realized that I can't do no better than take the examples of the Bengali maverick genius and author, Neeraj C. Chowdhury. He is now regarded as one of the finest stylists in the English language, because he is my favorite virtual cosmopolitan. His erudition in European literature was formidable. All kind of acquired in that remote area called Kishoreganj. And in his last years of his life, he lived in Oxford, where the Oxford dons acknowledged his erudition. And yet Chowdhury, in his formative years, he was reasonably well off in the village, but although he describes that his roof of his house was sort of thatched in Kishoreganj, and he had probably never met, let's say, a white man until in his 40s. In fact, Chowdhury makes a very interesting comment in his classic Autobiography of an Unknown Indian. I quote, "We read about England through the eyes of Jane Austen and others." And it's very interesting. We never in India see a daffodil, and yet we read Wordsworth. Interesting. But people can relate. So it's a world of imagination. And this virtual cosmopolitan, his values are entirely on an, that's the other thing, intellectual level. It doesn't impinge on his mode of living. He still continues to live like an Indian, but he thinks differently, or more internationally. Okay. So it's the real community created among strangers through the print medium. It's a sense of common project, the project of modernity. Okay, so this went on, and I won't, elaborate. This is roughly the idea, but I want to now finally come to perhaps the most difficult part of my talk. I confess it's still tentative and a work in progress. While writing this paper, it struck me forcefully that such global exchanges were by no means unidirectional. It's a commonplace, I think, to hold that all ideas flow from the West to regions outside the West. And I see this as a waterfall all the way from the West to the rest of the world. Yet, in his book, Oriental Enlightenment, J.J. Clark admonishes us. He said it's a persistent reluctance to accept that the West could ever have borrowed anything of significance from the East, or see the place of Eastern thought within the Western tradition. It's seen as lightweight, but a trivial part of the wider response against the modern world. So, this idea is so common, so pervasive amongst us, that it's very difficult to make the transition from this colonial representation to a new way of thinking. But we need to readjust our mindset for that. So let's think not of a waterfall, but a confluence of many streams which mixed and then go in different ways. A phenomenon of reciprocity. Now, much ink has been spilled over how the world was westernized. We all read about it, so we know it. But what about ideas and skills from outside the West absorbed by Europeans? I'll take one area now quickly, which I know reasonably well, art history. It's been a contentious issue among art historians as to the nature of debt owed by abstract painters, Kandinsky, Mondrian, and Malevich, to ancient Indian thought. We also know that Picasso always denied that he had anything to do with African art. Anyway, taking these abstract painters, one of the striking aspects, concepts in Mondrian, as well as other pioneers of abstraction, was the metaphysical idea of the absolute. And this is very Upanishadic, which enabled them to break from what they saw as the last vestiges of mimesis, imitation, proclaiming the reality as belonging to the spiritual. And they actually talk very specifically about Indian philosophy. Sorry. So on the left is painting by Mondrian, you probably would know, and the other one is, on the right is Kandinsky. Now, the facts of the case are not in dispute, but the implication and the significance attached to the rise of abstract art. So how much importance can we attach to the role of these ideas in the paintings of Piet Mondrian, Kazimierz Malevich, and Vasily Kandinsky, three iconic figures of modernism? So formalists dismiss such interests as simply inconsequential aberration. In fact, evidence to the contrary, despite evidence to the contrary, John Golding, a very important authority, as well as other modernists, have trivialized these abstract painters' deep engagement with the ancient Hindu texts, the Upanishads, as temporary mental aberration. Kandinsky was seen as mad when he kind of moved towards this thing. Anyway, so in their reassertions of what they see as Western rationality. Now, before I offer reasons for the serious Western engagement with Eastern thought, let me show you an interesting episode. You may know it. This is ancient Indian thought among American, even intellectuals. It's named by U.S. Geographic Board of Grand Canyon elevation rising to 7,646 feet. It's called the Shiva Temple. It's very interesting. I mean, that's something which I was quite struck by. But, but more interestingly, and this is where I'm going to end soon, the lasting, a serious impact of Indian thought on the major American intellectual movement, transcendentalism. By common consent, I think we all agree that one of the greatest members of the group was the poet Walt Whitman. In fact, on his deathbed, in a moving passage, Whitman speaks of the importance of ancient wisdom, even as he accepts the inevitability of modern progress. He expressed the hope that technology will help bring East and West together. But if you look at his masterpiece, Leaves of Grass, the great poet undertakes his own passage to India. It becomes a metaphor for a spiritual journey than a really literal trip to India itself. Why does he think of India in his last hours? Whitman collected ancient Indian material throughout his life, which informed the spirit of his poetry and explained his engagement with Indian philosophy. It could be that he saw himself as an outsider and he had links with British outsiders, E.M. Foster and somebody called Carpenter, but also in his friend, Henry David Thoreau, classic text Walden. Thoreau speaks of the pure Walden water mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. Interesting, I mean. Now, this was a very important movement in the 19th century that owed directly to the discovery of ancient Indian thought, and also a study of how ideas flow across national boundaries, but also using ideas from outside one old culture and its creative uses. And this was no different among American intellectuals than it was for Indian intellectuals, Indian virtual cosmopolitan. Of course, in the 19th century, US and India, the relationship was certainly colored by colonial prejudice, and so it was an asymmetrical one. Middle-class Americans particularly found, they were beneficiaries of the Industrial Revolution. They kind of, you might say, displayed a condescending attitude towards the low level of material comfort in India, and they speak about that. But nonetheless, we can't dismiss the intellectual discovery on the part of American thinkers simply as a manifestation of the colonial discourse of difference. Translations of Sanskrit classics, Buddhist, Hindu philosophy into European languages from the 19th century gave European intellectuals an entry point into thought of the complex cultures of Asia. Raymond Schwab celebrated it as the Oriental Renaissance in Europe, very much like the First Renaissance. Now, very early on, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1818, turned to Hindu thought. And his mother actually, aunt was responsible for introducing to Indian metaphysics. And then he also read other works, translated by Rammohn Roy. So what happens? Emerson's interest was to flower into what Whitman called the New World metaphysics. In fact, it liberated the transcendentalists from Christianity as well as European positivism. They wanted to do something different. And it was one of the most original movements to grow on the American soil. And it set up a remarkable conversation with Indian philosophy. So it enabled American thinkers to examine their own thought more critically. Each of the leading figures associated with Indian thought providing their own interpretation of the subject. On the left is Emerson and right is Walt Whitman. So and I think it's getting quite late, and I try to give you some idea of what the thrust of my talk was simply the problem of global communication, and also the impact of colonial power and visibility between the metropolis and the peripheries. It's always seen as uneven relations. Now, while there was colonial world order, but there were important developments in contact zones, and that didn't depend only on political imbalance. So I wanted to initiate discussions on this and thinking of other conceptual frameworks for studying cross-cultural ideas. So, in a way, I don't want to go any further, but I can talk to you more if you want. So I just want to show that when there's an intellectual engagement with thoughts of other societies, as in the case of America and India, that encounter became an instrument for scrutinizing one's own culture more critically. And that's often the case. So I would say, I would like to offer this virtual cosmopolitanism as a way of embracing the new and seeing the interconnections within the global culture. We're all now so involved with that. So I think I better stop here. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha Mitter. That was so brilliant and
Thank you.
wonderful.
Oh, God, I hope you, it wasn't too.
I pretended that I had read it, but I really wanted to listen.
Okay, thank
Listen to it. It was absolutely
you.
wonderful. Thank you so much. I think everyone would echo my sentiments. But I don't know what the time is. Okay, so we have about maybe about 15 minutes for questions. But thank you very much to our distinguished speaker, Partha Mitter.
Everybody inviting me. So
Yeah.
I'm very grateful. Thank you.
So there are mics. I think there are mics that will be
I'm
made
sorry
available
about
to
my
you. Just raise your
voice.
hand and someone will.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk.
Please identify yourself,
My name
Ashok,
is Ashok Vesh.
and stand up.
I'm sorry. That's big.
Well, I was,
Pay
I was,
homage.
I was taking a cue
seen.
from him that I would sit down and talk. But anyway,
I'm sitting down, so I can't do
very interesting talk and a very, to me, a very kind of colonial and Eurocentric perspective also. But just looking into the future, do you see a post-colonial cosmopolitan India? Or do you see, an India that asserts its own values without having to listen to Macaulay's and Emerson's and
India.
Whitmans of this world? Do you see us moving past colonialism into a new kind of cosmopolitanism? And do you see that happening in India?
There are a lot of issues you've raised. I mean, first of all, as the English poet John Donne had said, no man is an island. We take from each other all the time. Sometimes Europeans didn't acknowledge. But no culture can grow if it's pure, or whatever you might call it. It has to be, it has to have constant mixtures, constant ideas. So can it develop a sort of new? It can, but one of the things I have to say that in recent several hundred years, and let's be very honest about it, there hasn't been much critical tradition, and that has to grow. Whether in theatre or in literature or even in art, there's a lot of creative acts, but you need also critical apparatus, and that is, really still to grow. And I hope it does happen. I worry about that, and that's why I was very keen to set up a Department of Art History, to really, one small thing. I have to acknowledge, first of all, my art teacher, my guru. I've learned so much from him. So my critique of Western values, Western art history, is based on my studying of Western art. Such a wealth of tradition, art history, critical tradition over the centuries, and we cannot deny. I love a lot of different parts of areas of European art. I was just talking to a little while ago, Vermeer, Velázquez, and Cézanne, my three great heroes, and I'm a painter. I readily acknowledge that I've learned from them. That's not the point. Everyone learns from everybody else. That's what I was trying to say. This field of textuality, there's nothing new. We learn from different parts, from different people, and it continues. I mean, that is the thing with tradition and innovation. Why Europeans were in a position to do more, I don't know. There are lots of historic reasons. But having said that, what I do feel is important to be critical. And all my books are critical of certain values, you see. Recently, excuse me, I've been very involved with global art and the whole kind of problem between modern art, which is seen as European and claimed as its own territory, and non-Western modernisms. So I've been writing on decentering what I call modernism, and I'm deeply grateful that it's not that much listened to by Indians, I'm not sure, by Russian, Eastern European and Central European art historians. They have taken my ideas on board. And recently I gave a keynote in Poland where they're saying that they have been colonized by London, Paris, and New York. And that's very interesting. So, yes, I mean, we need to decenter, exchange. Art or any culture is hybrid, mix. Without this kind of constant feeding of the information, it dies. It's like, as you know, incest is a terrible thing because eventually it leads to lots of problems. You have to have mixture. Hybrid is the best thing. I'm always in support of mixture in every way. So, but India has to, a strong country, powerful country, has to grow its own tradition.
I had a question. I really appreciate your going over so many cosmopolitans as far as culture, as far as ideas, as far as images are concerned. So you talked about Rabindranath Tagore, you talked about Niro Chaudhary, and then here you talked about Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. So many different, I could think of Max Muller. But my question was, I was thinking, how you read about a different culture, and as you were saying, Neeraj Chaudhary hadn't seen he hadn't seen a Caucasian person, he hadn't seen a daffodil, but it was all part of his imagination, because sitting in his small study in his small town, he was reading about it. But do you think that also we can also reconceptualize ourselves?
Yes.
Because I was thinking about images. I was thinking about Bongo Mata, Bharat Mata by Abanindranath Tagore, that image of Bharat Mata as we still see it. And the poem Vande Mataram that Bankim Chandra wrote in 1875, he was the one who first painted that image actually. Bongo Mata later became Bharat Mata. So, and then also we have Rajmohan Roy, we have Vivekananda. So do you think that it's possible to reconceptualize oneself as one reads about different cultures, how they see themselves? And this is not just cultural ideas, but also political nationhood. So,
Thank you. It's a very good question. Thing is that, so in all these things, I mean, one needs to, of course, reconceptualize. But you see, what is ultimately very interesting, Rabindranath Tagore always said that he borrows shamelessly from everywhere. But ultimately what he produces of great originality. And Tagore has one of those people, highly original, he was always seen as by Europeans as well. And he was very vain, if I may say so. So he had never any inferiority complex. I was just telling again the other day, he goes to travels in Europe. He writes to Freud and says, "Can you come to my hotel to? I would like to meet you." Freud was very cross. He said, "What is the thing he is?" But he did go, and everywhere he's so confident, self-confident, because what he produced, he didn't feel that, oh, this is so derivative. This is just part of colonial, thing. I mean, it's very interesting that, and it was not it wasn't based on simply false thing. So India is a very powerful, very old, rich country. So there'll always be developments which will, and there's so much in any case there. Unfortunately, translation into European language is often very rare. Tagore has been little bit, but some of the great novelists like Sharat Chandra Chatterjee has never been translated. So it's a complex problem, but nonetheless, yes. Thank you.
First of all, that's a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
It was a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much. But you mentioned something that, the importance, and I agree with you, of the interchange between cultures and so on. But how about China, for example, which regarded themselves as the middle kingdom between earth and heaven? And they didn't pay attention to interchange. Japan also, till the Meiji Empire.
You're right. So Japan deliberately kept themselves away, but not for long. Then they went all the way to be westernized. It's because my son is, as you know, authority on Chinese culture. The Chinese in the 20th century became so disillusioned with their past. People like great novelist Lu Xun said that anything past is feudal and worthless. We must look at the West, we must, westernize. It didn't change the Chinese. I mean, it made them stronger. So they didn't care. They took everything, but ultimately they could, create. That's the thing. Whatever you might take, you have to, transform it according to your own kind of needs and create something new. And this is something right through. I mean, you could take Picasso as an example. He takes so many different aspects, but he creates something very, very new. So that's the thing, I feel. But Chinese and Japanese, they went all the way for Western culture. That's an interesting issue. I mean, we in India are much more conscious of our culture, which is a good thing. So that's probably more than Chinese. But nonetheless, China has a very strong sense of identity. Of course, I mean, we know it, so you say.
Will you take one more?
Yes, of course.
Just one.
No, sure. It's a pleasure. Go on.
Thanks for a brilliant talk, Misho.
Thank you very much.
This is the first time I've heard you speak, and
thank you.
it's incredible. Anyway, my question was about this idea of reconceptualization that Uli raised, and also how to become a better critic. So, for example, there's a school of music in North Bay, Ali Akbar Khan School of Music in San Rafael. So if you go and look at the student cross-section, you won't find a single Indian.
Why? Is that, yeah,
I have no idea why. Well, I have an idea why. It's because Bollywood is the new colonial power.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If
Fair
you
enough.
go to an Indian wedding, a Hindu-Bengali wedding,
Yes.
there's nothing either Hindu or Bengali about it.
Okay.
It is a Bollywood template.
Oh.
And I've never been so hurt by music in my life. I'm a student of classical music, and the point is that the music that passes at weddings these days, and it's a clone template. So how do you break out of this mold? How do you become critical enough to appreciate your own heritage, let alone the rest of the world?
That will come slowly, I hope. I mean, we're still, as a nation, we are very young. As a country, we're very old, you say.
As a nation, you mean as India? India as a nation?
Yes, multicultural. Sorry, but did you want to, Priyanka?
No question. Okay, you go. Since you're a friend.
So thank you for the talk, Partha.
Thank you.
I finally listened to you because I didn't when you were in my studio.
Thank you very
So
much. Yeah.
So, this is a question for art history and how do we look at Indian art history. I've always grappled with this question of need to find the one, which is, I feel, a little Eurocentric way to look at it. Like the weaving communities, there's no one artist. They weave together, they build together. Or when I was in Kumartoli, they all make it together.
Yes.
Or even Natraj, like who's that one artist who made Natraj? So how do you deal with that? How do we...
you mean the sort of ordinary, humble artists who still produce...
and not so ordinary, really.
Yeah.
The fact that he's learned to make it unique in their own way. So how do you... the sari they're weaving is very unique, really. So there is no one person who I can say, there's no one Donatello.
This is an anonymous tradition.
There is an anonymous.
Of course.
And artists perhaps like Dohosu is, kind of talks about that there is no one person. There are many of us building it together. So is it included in the way we see Indian art?
Developing. And that's one of the ways. Yeah, thanks for the question. But I personally feel there's so many different facets. And let's not also underestimate people who see themselves modernists. So it's a whole range. I do believe also that it's not all or nothing. It's always a whole range of things. But I do hope next generation, a proper Indian art history will gradually develop with critical tradition, and that's it for the future. Can I quickly tell you a funny story? On center and periphery, the center and margins. The great writer Borges in Argentina was full of himself. He was a great writer, and he was also not a very pleasant man, quite nasty. He met this Spanish film director, Luis Buñuel. Buñuel hated him. Anyway, so his last kind of thing was, when he published his memoirs, he mentioned a statement which Borges had made, and said, we don't say that in Spanish. So in other words, his Spanish wasn't the real thing. So if you're in the periphery, the center may not accept you. This is interesting. You see, and Borges then became very famous as a writer and a cosmopolitan. He always saw himself as a cosmopolitan. But those who live in the center don't think that they're kind of looking out the other ones who, I think, but let me not
I mean, you can continue to engage with him because we're going to have dessert and tea and coffee. But you can do it on a one-to-one basis. And again, thank you so much. And thank you very much for all my friends. I see so many faces. It's wonderful here. But I do want to thank the UCSC team. And now that we've dispensed with the formalities, at least I can single out the leadership that has come here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Raja. I mean, this is really sort of wonderful that you made the trek over. And usually it's us driving over, so I guess it's fair. But thank you, Carrie. And Partha will be available to you. He loves, as you can see, he loves engaging, and so he's available.
I just wanted to say something, Anu, that I thank all of you very much that you had the time to come and listen to me and sit patiently right through them. Thank you. My voice breaks. That's one of the problems.